You're listening to MJCF Presents Abolish, a conversational series uncovering truths from the family regulation system, aka Child Protective Services. My name is MJ. Let's jump right in.
Hi.
Hi.
Welcome, Ruchi.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I am so excited to have you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. For the audience, my name is Ruchi Kapoor, and I'm a lawyer at Kapoor Law and Policy. So thank you so much for having me on your show.
Absolutely. You've been an expert in the child welfare field for over a decade now.
Yeah, just about, which makes me feel old.
Oh, you're not. Oh, you're not at all. We have worked together for a couple of years now, a few years now. I wanted to bring you on because you talk a lot about policy reform and so forth, and civil rights in regards to the child welfare system. So may I start by asking you, how have you been involved in the child welfare system?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I've been a lawyer for the last 10 years, and I actually started my career clerking for the Denver Juvenile Court.
Okay.
And so when I was law clerking, it really opened my eyes to this area of the law that I've never experienced before. It was something that we never talked about in law school. You know, like child welfare law is like this very niche practice.
Yeah.
And so it's something that like you're not really exposed to as a law student. And so, when I graduated in 2010, I got my clerkship at the Denver Juvenile Court because I was interested in delinquency issues and criminal law. That's how I ended up clerking for the Denver Juvenile Court. And
may I ask, just for our audience, what does it mean to clerk for, clerkship?
Yeah,
what does that mean?
Like a legal clerkship is a little bit different than, like being the clerk of court, right? And I think a lot of people confuse them because it's the same term.
Mm-hmm.
Being a law clerk means that you're working for the court as a lawyer. So you're working directly for the judge usually. And so in this instance, it was interesting because the Denver Juvenile Court is a standalone court. It's one of the few in the country that is constitutionally dedicated. So it is a standalone court that has jurisdiction over just juvenile matters. So
wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it's like us and like Chicago. I think LA has a dedicated juvenile court, and ours was started in like the early 1900s, like 1901. So it's been around for a long time.
Yeah.
And the Denver Juvenile Court is cool because they specialize in juvenile matters. And when juvenile law is not a very old area of the law at all, right? Like it's not property. So it's when it started as like a philosophy of like, we need to treat children separately.
So juvenile law is a different kind of law.
It is,
and it's been recognized that juveniles. Let me ask you, what is considered a juvenile? What age?
So in the way that the Children's Code in Colorado works is you're essentially considered a juvenile, like you're in the jurisdiction of the juvenile court until the age of 21, if the court so chooses to extend the case. Like jurisdiction can expire, like the juvenile court can have jurisdiction over kids and families from pretty much like age of 0 to 21. But jurisdiction expires when the court either says that it expires or when the kid in the case turns 21.
Okay.
So,
why do they choose 21, just out of curiosity? If we know scientifically brains are not fully developed until age 26 now, and the frontal lobe, which is the impulsive behaviors and so forth, is not developed until age 26. Why do you think the law juvenile stops at 21?
Well, the law takes forever to catch up to what we know about social science, right? And like brain science, I think, moves so much faster than policy does, right? Like policy takes forever to change. And so I think when and I am actually not sure about the history of the age of 21 in the code. And I know that there's a new bill that the Colorado State Legislature passed this session where they can opt children who are aging out of the foster care system, they can be opted back into the system.
I heard about that.
And so I think that, as the brain science moves forward, policy is moving to catch up, but it's just, it's always going to be one beat slow.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. In clerking, for your first kind of career into law, what did that look like for you?
Clerking, it was great. What was unique about my clerkship was that usually legal clerkships, it's like one law clerk, one judge, and then you're forming this like very tight relationship, and it's supposed to be kind of a mentorship.
Oh.
Like I think about it as like residency for doctors, right?
Okay.
Like, so it's kind of like a nice mentorship and entrance into being a practicing lawyer, and then you can go from there into like whatever you're interested in. And so having that relationship with judges and that connection like kind of helps introduce you basically to the world of practicing.
That makes sense.
And so I like the Denver Juvenile Court was unique because I had 3 judges that I was working for, and there's like 3 or 4 magistrates that were there when I was there.
Okay.
So I kind of got to be the law clerk for everybody, and so I got to experience everybody's different style of practice, which was really, I think, looking back, a really unique experience. But I really loved it because not only did it expose me to the world of juvenile delinquencies and like how the children's code functions in like the criminal sense, right? Like when we have juvenile delinquents, but it also exposed me to the world of child welfare and how both of those things walk hand in hand, because oftentimes, like there would be so much crossover between like child welfare cases early on, like system involvement, and then we would see the kid again in like a delinquency case, and then, later I went on to become a criminal defense attorney, and then I'd be like, oh, I see back in your history, like whatever we're pulling, that there was some child welfare involvement in your youth, and you were in foster care, and you bounced from foster care to foster care, and now that you're over the age of 18, like you're being criminal, like you're charged as an adult in the criminal system, right? So all of these systems move together. It's not like you just have the child welfare system, and then you just have the delinquency system, and you just have the criminal system. It's like, there is a direct connection between all of them. And so that was what was really cool about being the law clerk for the Denver Juvenile Court.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
What was your next step? So then you kind of got introduced to child and family law and dependency and neglect cases, juvenile delinquency cases. What did you do after? What happened next?
So I was really interested in appeals. Like after, we're clerking for the Denver Juvenile Court, there's an internal appeal mechanism for magistrates, and the law clerk, like I got to investigate all those and handle the drafting of the order on the magistrate reviews, and I loved that. That was my favorite piece of my job, which is so nerdy.
Take it down, break it down for the people that are nerds, and tell us a little bit about appeal. So what does that mean when someone files an appeal?
Yeah, so like in the legal system, the way that appeals are set up procedurally, it's always going to be done in writing, and an appeal is always supposed to be like a cold file review. It's purely based on transcripts and anything that was written and entered into what's called the record, right? Like the court file. So when you're appealing something, both the, like if you have an attorney, if you're represented by an attorney on the appeal, and the court, all they're limited to looking at is the written materials.
I see.
So the way that internal appeal mechanism worked in the Denver Juvenile Court was that like we had these magistrates who were essentially employees of the court and served at the discretion of the chief judge of the Denver Juvenile Court, because again, the Denver Juvenile Court's like its own standalone court.
Yeah.
And so if a magistrate made a decision that somebody wanted to appeal, right, like they wanted another set of eyes, you could appeal it to one of the district court judges who was also a Denver Juvenile Court judge. And so the way that worked is you would file the motion, and then like that would come to me, the law clerk, and then as the law clerk, I would pull the transcripts, and then I would look at the motions that were filed, right, like whatever was in writing, and then I would kind of come up with what I thought was the correct decision. Like, do we affirm what the magistrate did? Did the magistrate correctly apply the law and make the right decision? And then I would go talk to the judge who, like, they would rotate through who was the judicial officer that was assigned to reviewing which magistrate. So I would talk to that judge and be like, this is what my initial feeling is, like this is the research that I did, and then the judge would say yay or nay, and then I would draft an order, and the judge would essentially sign off. So I was in the back, like doing all of the legwork on making the decision, which was really cool. That was a really cool part of my job.
Absolutely. Also, for our audience, can you explain the difference between a magistrate versus a judge?
I think that's a great question, because I think that's something that comes up a lot in the Colorado system, right? In the state of Colorado, judges are appointed through this very formal nominating process. The judges, like if you want to be a judge, you have to apply, then you go through what's called a nominating commission. So it's like a group of community members, like non-lawyers, like it's usually 50-50 non-lawyers and lawyers, those judicial nominating commissions. And they look at all the applications, and then they pick people to interview, and then they interview everybody, and then they send 3 names to the governor of like their recommendations of the 3 people that should be filling that judge spot. And the governor picks one of those 3 names. And so you're appointed by the governor. Those people essentially are only reviewed on the ballot. That's who we're voting on every time.
Okay.
Like, so that's a judge.
Okay.
And so they're like, you know, district court and county court, like that's how you get to be a judge. Magistrates are actually essentially like employees. So let's say that you have a really busy court that, you know, like for whatever reason that year, like there's a crime wave or whatever, you know, like you just need help in terms of overseeing the docket, because otherwise, like there's so many jury trials or there's so many other things going on, then you need to have, like the court can hire somebody, like another judicial officer. And because the formal appointment process takes forever, every court in the state has a budget for like what's called a magistrate. So a magistrate is still a judicial officer, and the chief presiding judge of whatever court it is in charge of hiring magistrates. Magistrates are usually lawyers also.
Okay.
And they do everything that a judge can do, but it's just that they're not appointed by the governor. They're essentially just hired by the court. Yeah, like the judge, like the chief presiding judge of that county.
Okay.
So they can also be fired, right? But they're like, they go through like review processes, like they're employees of the court system.
Okay.
Like there's like that level in the judiciary of you're appointed by the governor, and then like the way that we kind of review judges is through the ballot process. So that doesn't happen for magistrates. That's like the big difference.
That's what that was my next question. Is there anything that a judge can do that a magistrate cannot do in terms of the law?
So in juvenile cases specifically, like magistrates cannot reconsider their own decisions, which I think is a big thing, right? Like judges, you can file what's called like a motion for reconsideration, like if something changes in the law or something like that, like you can file that. If like magistrates can't do that. So there's case law that says that magistrates can't, you know, like if they make a decision, it's final and you have to appeal them essentially. So that's like one of the biggest differences. I think there's a whole, like in the statutes, like there's some things that magistrates just can't preside over, like jury trials in juvenile cases. Like when you have an adjudicatory jury trial, you have to set that in front of a district court judge.
Okay.
A magistrate can't do that. But I think magistrates can pretty much do almost everything else. So they can, like as long as it's designated.
They have that power to do that. Okay, that's good to know.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Because I know we have a lot of audience that are either professionals in the field, but may not know exactly what that looks like behind the scenes. And then we also have families that have been involved in the system that sometimes that's not explained correctly to them. So I want to make sure that everyone can get the same information that we have moving forward, just to be educated in the system. So thank you so much for that. So tell me about the appeals. So that's kind of been your interest. So after you were finished clerking, what did that look like for you? What was your next step?
So after I finished clerking, I ended up going into private practice and just doing exclusively appellate work for 3 years. And I was representing respondent parents. I was like one of like a handful of attorneys statewide that did appeals for respondent parents because of the way the procedural rules worked before 2016. So I was doing respondent parent appeals, but again, I was only doing a handful because not very many people were appealing at that point.
What year was this?
I was doing respondent parent appeals. That would have been 2011 through 2015.
And the reason why I ask you what year is because, so I've been in the child welfare field, I think since 2012, 2013. There was not, I didn't even hear about parents appealing.
Really. Nobody appealed.
No one really appealed at the very beginning of my career in child welfare. But recently, oh my gosh, I mean, we've had a huge increase of appeals that parents are saying, I have a right to continue to fight.
That, I think most every county attorney in the state would tell you is my fault. So so after I was in private practice doing appeals, I did criminal defense appeals and respondent parent appeals, and then that was pretty much like the basis of our practice. I did some immigration work, like crimmigration, I would call it. Did a lot of post-conviction kinds of things, but I did a lot of appellate work representing, like that's where my passion was like representing indigent folks who, and then we did county court to district court appeals, right? So we did all kinds of appellate work, like
Wow.
where it's like a very niche practice.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, and I would have probably stayed at that firm doing appellate work like for the rest of my career. I was so happy
Wow.
doing appellate work. I loved it. In like mid 2015, like end of 2015, I was approached by the now ex-director of the Office of Respondent Parents Council that she had been selected by this commission to like start this state agency, and that what she really wanted to do was one of the positions that she wanted to create as part of, the ORPC. She was informally calling it like appellate director. She was like, because I just think that no parents really exercise that right to appeal.
Yeah.
And that's part of what this new agency should be doing. And I was like, yes, that 100% feels like where I should be. So, so she offered me that job, and I ended up being the first appellate director for the Office of Respondent Parents Council.
Amazing.
So that was
for the entire state of Colorado.
Yeah. So that was starting like February 2016 is when I
Wow.
started that gig.
Okay.
So, and that's, like it was funny because that first year that we just opened our doors and said, hey, we as a state agency, our policy is that if you are indigent, because it is a statutory right to appeal, we are also going to guarantee that you have state paid counsel to do the appeal. And in that first year, appeals and D&M cases went up by 42%. So it almost doubled. The Court of Appeals started freaking out. Or Court of Appeals. Because we just like increased their caseload by a ton.
Oh my geez.
Just by virtue of like opening our doors and
Yeah.
saying, we have this resource now, and like there's a way and a mechanism for parents to exercise that right to appeal in a meaningful way.
Wow.
So
That's amazing. So now, where are we now? So you were with ORPC here in Colorado as the appellate director, and then where to now?
So in January of 2021, I went out on my own as a solo attorney. So I started my own law firm. It's called Kapoor Law and Policy.
Kapoor Law and Policy.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful.
So here in Colorado. So I'm doing, I think the thing is like, working for the ORPC, I loved working on that policy level. Like I loved having that bird's eye view of what was happening statewide, and like being able to, part of my job at the ORPC was engaging at the Capitol. So I was representing parents and the interests of parents in helping to formulate legislation and change things at the Capitol.
What's an example of that?
So like one of the bills that we worked on, like we would be called to be stakeholders at the table whenever anything was changing the children's code in the state, right? So like,
what is my apologies,
That's okay.
just for our audience, what is the children's code, and how is that important and relevant to the child welfare system?
So the children's code is all of the statutes that govern what happens in court when child welfare cases make it to court.
Okay.
So they really govern essentially the filing of what's called a dependency or neglect case, right? And that's when you have state involvement and the state wants to remove your children. Most of the time, it should every time result in a state filed case, a petition in court, where then you due process protections attach, right? Because you're at risk of losing your constitutional right to parent. The Children's Code specifically governs how that court proceeding goes forward.
So it is like the Bible of the child welfare.
Of lawyers in the child welfare system, yeah. So that's what they live and die by. That's what governs exactly what's happening in court, is the Children's Code.
Okay.
Because, the other pieces of it are like the delinquency and
Sure.
like adoption and relinquishment, and those kinds of things also fit into the Children's Code.
Okay.
But the big piece of it is child welfare.
Okay.
So that was a lot of, what we were working on at the Capitol was like if people were introducing bills that would change how statutes work and govern the process. We were always invited as stakeholders, and so I would go to those meetings and kind of be like, well, from a parent's point of view, like, it's not okay to just kind of change that word, so let's like tailor it, and
So
that was really interesting work.
So your job was to kind of see if they're introducing new things into as policies, procedures, and within that, you're saying, how can this negatively impact parents, essentially?
Yeah.
That is your lens.
That was our lens, and like
Okay.
we were essentially took the viewpoint that, like at the Capitol, it was our job to not just serve the interests of indigent parents, although that's who we're statutorily supposed to be representing. It was also like we represent parents, because oftentimes that's the voice that's missing at the table when policies are being put together, when people are thinking, like the child welfare system, I think it's really heavy on folks who are all about protecting children, and it's really easy to get on board with protecting children. But I think sometimes what that does is we're protecting children at the cost of torturing adults. And I think that's a really hard lens to put on things, right? And so it was really kind of incredible work to be able to just be at the Capitol and be able to monitor and be a part of all of these discussions that are happening and make sure that that's a voice that wasn't left out of the conversation.
That is very important.
Yeah, so that was a huge part of my work at the ORPC.
Amazing.
So when I started my law firm in January, I really loved that policy work, but I wanted to be able to go in a little bit of a different direction with it. And so, yeah, that was kind of how I got here. That's how we connected, through the coalition. Is I'm very, very passionate about, like, how do we reform child welfare in other ways, right? Like there's other ways outside of, like, you can change policy through engagement at the Capitol. And I think the ORPC and having that resource of the ORPC at the Capitol is a really wonderful thing for parents. And I think a lot of people don't realize how important it is that ORPC is there. Like there's such a good watchdog for that. But I think there are other ways too.
Yeah.
To move it forward.
And I think that kind of drives into the conversation of why the MJ Consulting firm, because our job is to dismantle racist practices and systemic racism in the child welfare system. And that includes abolishment of the child welfare system of how we know it.
Right.
And not necessarily completely taking away any safety measures or protections for children.
Right.
The most vulnerable population.
Right.
We do that in many different ways. So we do that by doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and working with certain agencies that may work with the vulnerable population.
Right.
And we also do that through education. We do that through the coalition, which is kind of how you got brought into this picture. Will you tell me a little bit about what your position and what your role is with the MJ Consulting Firm's coalition?
So I think, what kind of brought me here was that I fell in love with the idea of what's called movement lawyering.
What is that?
And so movement lawyering, it really was pioneered by lawyers who were partnering with the BLM, Black Lives Matter movement. And I think, what we've learned in like a really incredibly painful and hard ways is that I think like through the civil rights movement is that sometimes lawyers and civil rights attorneys, you go with the case that you have. So the civil rights attorneys, like the way that they work and the way that they historically always operated is on a case-by-case basis. Like you're going to take the facts that you have and you're going to litigate those facts as hard as you can, no matter what the outcome is. And sometimes that creates really interesting case law based on like, what happens. And sometimes it can create some wonky things that happen. So like the other day was Loving Day, for example, right? The day was to celebrate the anniversary of the Loving v. Virginia civil rights decision, which came down in 1967. And that decision was the one, like it was a very important civil rights victory of knocking down anti-miscegenation laws, which are laws that make it illegal to marry someone of another race. And I think that's a really important, history. It's an important anniversary.
Absolutely.
It's been 54 years, which is not...
I can't believe it's only been 54
Yeah.
years. That's so uncomfortable.
It's only been 54 years since it's been legal to marry someone of outside your race. And I think, like those are the kinds of things that we need to think about as we're moving forward. But sometimes, like those old civil rights victories too, we're not moving in lockstep. What else was happening in the civil rights movement at the time? Because 1967 was a different year if you look at it from the point of view of like MLK and what was going on with the movement itself. Whereas Loving v. Virginia, like if you read any interviews with the couple, they were just like, we didn't want to be civil rights heroes, like she was this like biracial woman and he was a white man, and they just, you know, they just fell in love and like they got married, but they got married in Washington D.C. where you could marry someone outside your race, and then they moved back to Virginia where they had a law in the books that said that you couldn't marry someone outside your race, and they didn't know that it was illegal in Virginia, and there was a raid at 2:00 in the morning by the police because they had been outed by their neighbors, and so the police came and arrested Mr. Loving, and his wife wrote a letter. This is how it started. She wrote a letter to then Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who referred her to the ACLU, and the ACLU took the case, and that's how we got that opinion, right? So it was like a one-off.
Shout out to the ACLU.
Yeah.
Shout out to the ACLU.
Yeah. So it was kind of its one-off in this corner, right?
Sure.
But it's a really important civil rights victory, but it's like, think about how much more impact and you could have had if they were partnering with other people as a class action. Like, that's how we got modern litigation around same-sex marriage.
Mm.
And that was the evolution of that.
Wow.
The early civil rights movement kind of taught us was that sometimes the law does not move in lockstep with what's happening in the community, right? Like a little bit ago, we talked about how, you know, it's 21 in the children's code, and it's like, why isn't it 26? It's because we just realized that it was 26 when our brain's fully mature. We didn't know that.
I see.
So I think the same is true for our civil rights in this country, right? Like, they're always evolving. We're always on a journey with it.
True.
And kind of the journey as it's moved forward, what we've realized is that it's really important for lawyers to work in tandem with not only communities, but with activists on behalf of the community, right? So as we're developing policies and we're moving forward in terms of, sure, we're abolishing, right? But what's coming next? What's in its place? Like,
how are we building? We are trying to demolish over here as we build something new and different.
So it's usually the role of lawyers to demolish.
Okay.
But you have to demolish in the right way in order to build in the future, right? And so you have to make sure that those things are working hand in hand. And so that's kind of the idea of movement lawyering, is that like you have to partner activists who are usually the ones with the vision of what the future should be, right? Whereas lawyers are the cynics in the back who are just like, no, we need to burn it down.
Yeah, that's not gonna work.
That's not gonna work. So, but you need to have both of those pieces, right? Like, they're a really good balance, and they have to work in tandem. And so the idea behind movement lawyering is that you're partnering those things so that you're making sure that as policy moves forward, that the community is involved in terms of how we're rebuilding and what the future reforms look like. Because sometimes you're leaving voices out at the table, and like, you'll have certain activists show up and they're leaving a certain lens out because the activists are coming from a certain mindset, right? And so then you'll develop policies based on those activists.
Yes.
And all of a sudden you've left an entire community or an entire set of voices out at the negotiation table. And so I think that's kind of the goal of movement lawyering, is making sure that you have somebody at the table that's coordinating not only legal strategy, but is coordinating with the activists and making sure we're pulling in other community voices, and are there people from this community that are represented at the table, and what about this lens? Like, do we have someone from this lens? And so I think that's like the idea behind movement lawyering, and that for me was a huge part of why I wanted to get back into private practice. Because I love that idea. I love that we can evolve systems in a way that is very reflective of the community that the system is serving.
That is such a big deal. And I didn't even know anything about movement lawyering until you explained it to me. And I'm like, how are we not doing this?
I don't know.
You know, like how is this recent and new and so forth? Because it's all about that community piece. And I think that's why with the MJ consultant firm, we talk about community is everything. That's why we have people that join that are professionals and survivors and community members. So it's everyone that cares about the child welfare system and inequality within the child welfare system.
Right. And
which is like an oxymoron to me. But
well, I think about it this way, right? Like, have you ever heard of that Aesop's fable of like the blind man and the elephant? So you have, and like the story goes is that like you have 7 blind men in a room with an elephant, right? And one blind man is like touching his stomach and is like, oh, it feels leathery. And then you have one blind man that's touching like the elephant's toenails, like, actually it's kind of smooth. And then you have another man that's touching or a woman, I guess. Sorry to be patriarchal with this story. You have like someone that's touching like the trunk and is like, actually it's kind of hairy and prickly. And then you have someone that's touching the tail and it's like, actually it's like hairy, prickly, and weird and rubbery, right? All of those things are correct. So everyone that has experienced the elephant is correct, but they've only experienced the piece of the elephant that they're touching. But you need to have all of those pieces together to explain to you an elephant as a whole. And I think of that all the time when we're talking about systems, right? Is like, you have parents who've gone through the system and they've experienced the system in a certain way. And that's something that I'm never going to be able to understand as a lawyer because I haven't had that experience. Absolutely. But you've also had foster children who've experienced the system. They've experienced it in a certain way too, but I'm not going to be able to understand that either, but we need you in the room.
Yes.
Social workers, caseworkers, lawyers, all the professionals. Everybody has experienced the child welfare system in their own piece of it, like their own like rubbery or spiky or smooth. But we need all those pieces together in order to actually move the elephant out of the room. So I think that's kind of what I think of when I think of systems reform, right? It has to be all of those unwieldy pieces together, and like then you can move forward.
That makes sense. That's amazing, and thank you for that. I'm all about visuals, so that just created a great visual for me. So I want to talk about what your connection is with the coalition and how you have graced us with your beautiful brains and advocacy work, and you took us on as a client.
Yeah, I think, the reason that I took on the coalition as a client, I think it's really important, like I was talking about earlier, is like one of the things that we forget about policy is that policy has to work in multiple different ways and in multiple different arenas, right? Like, so now you have this group of appellate attorneys for the ORPC who are arguing on a case-by-case basis, right? And I'm really proud to say that I helped start that. I thought that was
amazing.
I think that's a really, like, looking back, like, that was amazing that we were able to do that and, like, launch that program. And then, so we have that piece. And then we have the ORPC representing parents and parent voices in statute creation and that piece of policy creation at the Capitol. And like with the governor's office, I think that's a big deal. For me, I think the third leg of that stool, in terms of actually making meaningful policy change, is actually civil rights work and working with the community to identify cases that are real civil rights violations. Because I think that's part of what's been happening. Like, I think a lot of people perceive the child welfare system as this like entity that's out in a good way, right? Like, they're not out to get anybody, like they're protecting children. And I think sometimes reputation can really disguise like just unconstitutional practices.
Justice.
Yeah, like they can be very unjust, because sometimes, even if every actor in the room is motivated by this sense of saviorism,
sure,
and doing the right thing, I still think the actions that result from that motivation can add up to be not so good.
Absolutely.
And so I think one of the last pieces of policy reform and ensuring that there is accountability for the system from the outside is being a civil rights watchdog. And I think that's, that's kind of what I signed up to work with the coalition to do. I think that's going to be part of our role, is being a civil rights watchdog. I think the ACLU now is like this organization that they do a lot, but I think everyone is kind of scared of the child welfare system in terms of when I talk to civil rights attorneys, and it's because they don't know how it works.
Yes.
And not only do they not know how it works, it's also like, this is a good system,
because of what we've been told about the system.
Yeah.
And that's why I think I really like the idea of bringing in everyone to be a part of this coalition. That's why we say community members, survivors of the system, people that are currently still in the system, and professionals, because there is this ideology about safety in children and who needs to protect them.
Right.
Instead of empowering communities in order to feel safe and govern themselves and protect themselves.
Right.
We're always looking at an outside, which is a modern day colonization. It's a different form of colonization. It's saying you don't parent this way. Now, mind you, And I always like to say this because you always get people that say, I know this case and this parent is terrible.
Right.
And I will 100% agree with you.
Me too.
100% agree with you.
Absolutely.
100%. And I have been doing this work for over a decade. And we do know statistically that out of 100%, there's about 9 to 10% of those cases where it's like egregious abuse, right?
Absolutely.
The ones that make the news.
Right.
But there's between 85 and 90% that just need help, and that's poverty.
Right.
Involved.
Right.
Mental health issues.
Right.
You know, severe breakdown, substance abuse, usually because of mental health and so forth.
Right.
And those are the cases that people don't know about.
Right. And I think, you know, like where the gap sometimes falls is like, because I know that like the Department of Human Services, like they publish all these stats on their website, and have you seen the reverse funnel, right?
Ooh,
so they publish what they call the reverse funnel, and the reverse funnel is kind of like, these are all the people that came to the Department of Human Services and that we were able to help, and that we only had to intervene a little bit and we funneled them out.
Nice.
Right? So it's like we got all, like these are all the intake calls we got. Like this is the number of calls that we get a year, and then we funnel them down into like being able to get people out of the system as quickly as possible. And they publish, like the Department of Human Services in Colorado at least, they publish those stats every year. They are always up to date on their website. Like they publish them on a monthly basis.
That's amazing.
And they're funneling cases out, right? And the case rates are astounding. Like when you measure against like the number of mandatory reporter calls that they get, and how many are screened out, and how many are screened out, and how many are screened out at this stage, and at this stage, and at this stage, and that only like this small percentage at the bottom of the funnel, right? Like the triangle little part of the cyclone end up in court. It's only a small percentage that end up in court, right? And even the Department of Human Services will say, like, that's a win because we're doing our job, because we're funneling, we're only intervening and removing children in the most serious and egregious of cases. And I think the gap is, are we sure that those are the most egregious of cases at the bottom of the funnel? And the measures for that, I think, are difficult to understand. They're complex. There's nuanced discussions that happen there. And I think that's where, you know, like the gap there between what the Department of Human Services thinks is eligible for a court filed case versus what should be a court filed case is, you know, that's absolutely the space that MJ Consulting and the coalition operate in. And I think that there's room in there to have a conversation about funneling people out of the system, but in a way that's respectful of their civil rights, right? Because that's ultimately the problem.
Yeah. No, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for saying it like that. If people were to ask, what kind of cases would you represent under the coalition, and how can people get representation or work within the coalition to be represented? What would that look like?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think we're still developing, you know, what the intake process is going to look like for the coalition and how we serve, you know, both the community and the movement itself in terms of making, like, reshaping the system, right? So if you are a family member or someone that has been denied placement of a child that's been removed from another family member for like a 20-year-old drug charge or something like that, I think that I think is something that should be re-examined. There's a nuanced conversation to be had there already. I think
I want to sit there just for a minute, just to explain to our audience. So we've done this work for many, many years. And anytime a child is removed from the birth family, the birth parents, and they're placed in foster care, the department's first job is to find next of kin. And they do that for a short-term basis. So they can do that and say, just until the parents finish their treatment plan. Treatment plan can involve substance abuse treatment, domestic violence treatment, mental health treatment, and so forth. And then if we get to a different place in the case where the parents were not, as we say, quote unquote, successful with their treatment plan, then they're looking for a permanent option for the child or the children to be. So again, the first option is to always look at kinship. And family. Birth family is like the grandmothers, grandfathers, aunties, uncles, so forth. Kinship can be anyone that the family can see as quote unquote family. That's so a kinship can be, you know, we've had the same babysitter for our family and she's lived down the street for 5 years. That can be a kinship placement because the family knows them and so forth. Where we run into the issues that we have is that there is a database system that anytime the child welfare system is involved, people are put into that system that can then make it to where that they're not able to be a placement option. So like, for instance, we've had a couple of stories and I've had a couple of cases where there was a grandfather that wanted to be a placement option for his grandchildren, but he had a charge of 20 years and it was a manslaughter charge. I believe he was 17 years old and he was driving while intoxicated. I believe his partner, a friend at the time, had died in that car crash. Well, of course, that person has served their time. They paid back and so forth. And 20 years later, they're not able to be a placement option because of that being on their record. So that's the issue that I've had with a lot of kinship, where things that have happened many years ago. If it's not sexual abuse and if it's not severe, violence, we need to always relook at that. If this is a drug charge,
like what's the nexus of harm to these children, right?
Exactly.
It can just be used as another tool to exclude somebody who, might otherwise be serving the funnel, right? Like, be able to get the government out of these people's lives.
Absolutely.
And so I think we have to examine that with a more critical lens of like, how does this actually impact safety?
Yeah.
If someone has like this 20-year-old marijuana charge and, now in Denver, you can possess up to 2 ounces.
Yeah,
so.
absolutely. Absolutely. There are a lot of pieces from the kinship. Another piece that has been disappointing, to say the least, with the Department of Human Services is them not actively looking for birth family. And sometimes they will have a foster family that is lined up.
Right.
They'll have a foster family that is an adoptive family, which means that they are fostering, but their goal is to eventually adopt, which there's many concerns with that, because we should not be using the foster care system as a government adoption agency. But there are people that do sign up specifically if they cannot afford to adopt and go through a private adoption agency, then they will go through the Department of Human Services.
Well, because they become the hero in that story, right? Like, it's not, like we want to, like, I struggle with ascribing malevolent intent to all of the people that are part of the system, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think, no, we're human. We all have this human impulse to be the hero of our own story. It's just that at what expense, right?
Yeah.
So we have a really hard time stepping out of our own kind of ego way of thinking about a story.
Absolutely.
And so in that story, like, foster parents are desperate. They've been trying to conceive for years, and we can save a child from this terrible life that they're going to have. And look at what great people we are.
Yes.
That is interesting. But okay, let's flip it and reverse it, right? And so, like, from that child's point of view, you're taking the child away from the only home that they've ever known. And the only thing that they've ever known, and you're putting them into a new place with new people, and you're saying to the kid, well, this is a new family now.
Yeah.
And maybe the adoption will work and maybe it won't, because we can talk about, like, disrupted adoptions and what happens after that. That's a whole different conversation.
1 out of 3.
Right.
1 out of 3 adoptions.
So,
and this is not only within the child welfare system, but just adoptions in general.
Right.
1 out of 3.
Right. And I think that's
a lot.
1/3 is an astounding rate. And so I think most people don't think about the story from that lens, because they want to center themselves in the narrative of being the hero.
Absolutely.
And so I think that's what's hard, is like, you have to pull yourself, like, that's part of the hard work of making sure that we are all part of the system, is pulling yourself out of that narrative, being like, okay, what are my actions doing in the context of someone else's life?
Ooh, and that is huge. Another piece about the kinship is I go after the Department of Human Services, because their job is to find biological family first, kinship first.
Yeah.
A lot of the times, the child welfare system, it is an ugly beast, and it's a dark secret, and it's heavy. There's a lot of shame that comes with that if you're a parent involved in the system. There's a lot of shame if you're a child involved in the system, because you are being outed to have an unhealthy family. I've been in those shoes before, where you feel that you're going to be outed, that people are going to find out that you are not with your family, due to whatever they want to assume, because sometimes that's not always the full truth. So with that being said, I've always looked at the department to do more in finding the birth family, because I've had clients that are parents that have said, no, there's no family that my child can go to. And a lot of that has to do with, if they are embarrassed and shamed, they feel as though that it would negatively impact their community, the only community that they have. And then they have the hope because they can't fathom that they will never see their children again and lose their rights. They cannot fathom that the TPR, which is termination of parental responsibilities, is the death penalty of families within child welfare.
Right. And I think a lot of people, like when we're advising them, you know, like I've seen it where it's like you're a deer in headlights, and it's because I'm watching you actively be traumatized by the system. So when you're in that fight, flight, or freeze space of trauma, you cannot process that really your legal rights to your children, i.e. your children could be taken away from you forever. Like that's what's on the line.
Absolutely.
When you're operating from that lizard brain space, that's not computing.
No.
And I've watched people who are actively not computing that was a possibility until they go home or they're out of the active trauma and then they're not in court anymore and they're like, hold on, what just happened?
Yeah, and it still doesn't seem real.
Me? And even then it doesn't seem real.
No,
because you're avoiding. And you know, like I think that's why the system is so hard.
Yeah.
We're triggering people, but we're also trying to help them.
Absolutely.
And it's, you know, it creates this like no-win situation.
And we are looking, as far as you taking on the coalition as a client, we are looking for kinship. We're looking for a lot of kinship. And the reason why I say that is because if the Department of Human Services, let's say, did not find biological family, did not find birth family of this child that is now placed in foster care, then they will try to look for a permanent home for that child while the parents are still fighting to regain custody. So on the back burner, the child is already placed in a permanent home.
Yeah.
So people work a little differently. They're just like a little lackadaisy when it comes to the parents. They're not as pushing the parents as when kids are not placed in permanent homes that everyone's like, you have to get this together. We have to complete this case because there's nowhere to put this child. But with that being said, there's been many cases that I've been on where the child is placed in an adoptive home, still while in foster care, and the biological family is found, let's say 9-10 months into a case. And then the Department of Human Services will say, sorry, the child is too attached to the foster family, and therefore we don't want any biological family to disrupt this child.
Right, and I find that really interesting because I think the again, like all of the new this is an old policy, right? Like it's based on attachment theory, and a lot of judges think of themselves as experts on attachment theory.
I have to just stare off for a minute. I just have to stare off for a minute. Okay.
Am I traumatizing you by
absolutely
saying that?
100%. Absolutely 100%. We know that psychology
is not true.
Is used as a tool against families of color and against poor families.
It totally is, and I think
they don't even know how to spell attachment, and somehow their attachment. That's not my business. Okay.
So, that being said, I think that a lot of those judges, you know, then like that's really old. That's an old school way of thinking about it. Is that like you cannot form once you're attached. You cannot form a new attachment, even though the reason that the kids are in this new attachment is because we disrupted their old attachment.
Absolutely.
So, and I think, you know, like where the policy needs to go, though, is that this isn't about attachment, because you can't just have it's just like one line. We have one fishing line of love. Way. Like that's just how we operate, is one fishing line of love. I don't think about it that way. I think what the science is showing us is that the opposite of a lot of the issues that we see in these cases is community, and it is developing multiple supportive adult relationships. So it's not just that you're attached to one primary caregiver, because we all go back to that like monkey experiment, right? Like with the wire monkeys and we really fucked up those poor baby monkeys in the 60s. And I think that's what everyone thinks of, right? That's what's in the textbooks. And then that's it. Well,
let's take it further, though. Let's say, who were the research participants? Were they children that were involved with the foster care system? No. Were they families of color that had trauma?
No.
That had trauma due to the foster care system?
Right.
Like, you're not even using the correct participants. So this is coming from myself that studies international psychology and cultural respect in regards to psychology. So when people try to use psychology as a tool against these families to say this is what it is, I am infuriated.
Yeah, and I think that's been a long-standing pattern, and that's a long-standing habit that's going to be hard to break in the human. Like we, as a system, have become addicted to the idea of attachment, and I think attachment theory is great, and it's a wonderful tool, but we have to use it in a way that it makes sense. And I think sometimes it doesn't make as much sense outside. Like it has to be interwoven with cultural context,
Absolutely.
right? Like you can have multiple attachments to lots of adults as a kid, right?
And we know this culturally. There's generational parenting. There's generational households. It doesn't mean
totally.
This 2-year-old. Well, even though grandmother and uncle lives in the home, I only want to see my mom and my dad.
And it's because attachment theory is being applied in a way that it's like marching in lockstep with the ideal, the white ideal,
Eurocentric,
the Eurocentric ideal of a 2-parent household, which we know really only existed at one very small moment in the 1950s in America. Outside of that decade, that ideal has never been the way that we've raised families as a human species.
You're right.
And so by using that ideal walking in lockstep with attachment theory, that's how it turns into a weapon in these cases, which is unfortunate, right? Like you have to think about it in the context of community, and you can have multiple attachments. So to disrupt one, but then to reform a bunch is okay. It'll be okay.
Absolutely.
But I think it's really hard. It's a really hard habit to break because we want to reach permanency in a way where it looks for these children like 2-parent,
Yeah, and we know there's
Leave It to Beaver situation.
And there's a lot of, discrimination against, same-sex couples, and we know that as well. Even if they're biological families, same-sex, people feel uncomfortable if they're not familiar with it. There's so many biases that go into the child welfare system, and that is something that we know.
So coming back to the civil rights context then, the other piece that we're looking for, through the coalition, the other way to hold the system accountable, I think, for some of those biases is making sure that, in the process of parents interacting with the system, right? Like from the viewpoint of a parent, like the people that we'd be looking for are people who are pre-filing, so they haven't had a court case filed on them yet.
Okay. Do these include quote unquote voluntary cases?
Yes.
Okay.
Any voluntary, if you're in a voluntary case, that is definitely who the coalition needs to be looking for.
How can you identify a voluntary case?
If you have a social worker in your life and you don't have a
caseworker.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
Get those. I am just as bad as everybody else about that.
That's completely fine. The reason why I like to make that correction is because social workers can be caseworkers, but not all caseworkers are social workers. Correct. Because to be a social worker, you need to have a degree in social work, either a bachelor's degree in social work or a master's level degree in the field of social work.
Right.
So I believe it was something like 60% of caseworkers do not have a degree in actual social work. So we're looking at that. But I only like to say that I don't get offended at all. I just want the audience to know that there is a difference, because then they will think, oh, social workers are caseworkers that remove kids.
Yeah.
So, but yes, my apologies.
So, yes.
If you have a caseworker in your life.
If you have a caseworker in your life, if you have anyone from the Department of Human Services knocking on your door, but you don't have a lawyer, you've never been advised, call us. Okay. That's who we want to be talking to. Okay. Like in the upside down funnel of the Department of Human Services language, right? Like we want everybody that's in the top part of the funnel.
Yeah.
Because that's probably where a lot of the accountability needs to come from for the rest of the system. I also think, if you are a former child who's been involved in the foster care system, I think those are also folks that we need to be talking to, because I'm sure that, from that point of view, I think there is a lot to be made about, enforcing accountability in the system on behalf of foster children.
What kind of people, survivors of the system, the children survivors of the system, what would they come to us and tell us, and how would we be able to help them?
I'm not sure. It depends. It's so factually dependent. We could help them. We could not help them. The other problem and one of the biggest hurdles in civil rights cases is, there's a timing issue. And so there's a time frame within which you can bring these claims. So sometimes we're just going to be plain out of time and there's nothing to be done. But, you don't know until you check in, until you ask. And, I think that's exactly who we want you to be checking, right? We always want everyone to be pushing and questioning and asking why, because that's one of the best ways to dismantle the system is by asking why.
And we're looking for patterns as well. We're looking for a lot of patterns.
One of the most important pieces of reform and reform work is identifying patterns.
Okay.
And so, sometimes there are going to be cases and situations where, there might not be an actual civil rights claim or anything we can do legally. But what it does is it helps us identify, in this county, like this thing seems to happen a lot. What can we do then to tailor reform to whatever we've identified that pattern to be? So even if, I think like the main people that we're looking for in terms of civil rights claims that we really think could have active civil rights are people that are in voluntary cases, parents who may have had a case court filed on them, but they're what's called adjudication, right, under the Colorado Children's Code. If you're pre-adjudication, I think we can still talk about the possibility of like some kind of civil rights kind of element of help. And then, the other people that we're looking for obviously are kinship folks, like family members and other people that have been denied placement of a child.
Mm-hmm.
The kid then goes to foster care instead, and former foster youth. So those are like the main four people that I think have identified civil rights issues that we can address through like what we talk about as like traditional civil rights litigation. But that doesn't preclude everyone else from talking to the coalition, really, because we're trying to identify, again, like that's the point of movement lawyering, is we want to identify patterns that may be occurring either in counties, like is there one really pernicious caseworker in like a one specific county that's just out to get everybody, whereas like everybody else in the county is really upholding what it means to be in the community and helping and advocating, right? And you just have this one like bad egg. That could be a problem.
Sure. So let's say a parent lost the rights, had their rights terminated, let's say 3 years ago, and they believe that they were done completely wrong and there was straight up racism involved. What could we do for them?
I'm not sure legally if there is much to be done, right? Like at that point, like you've given up the right to appeal. Like if you haven't appealed, your right to appeal, it attaches within 21 days, right? Under the current iteration of the Colorado Rules of Civil Procedure. So I think if you're like 3 years out or like years out from that entry of the termination of parental rights, I think hopefully under this year's laws, like we can negotiate a little bit, like so respondent parent attorneys will be able to negotiate through a system like open adoptions and other kinds of agreements, which I think will benefit both foster parents and and kinship. So I think those kinds of open adoption agreements are something that we should all be keeping our eyes open for, because the law is changing in that direction.
That's amazing.
But I think 3 years out, we're not going to be able to do much. We're going to be able to help you maybe if adoptive parents are open to it, like reconnect, or figure out how to make yourself ready if your children reach out to you. That's like doing the emotional work.
Yes.
Like I think that's what's going to be more important 3 years out. It's not going to be looking for a legal remedy.
Okay.
It's going to be doing the emotional work to make sure you're ready if your children come back.
Absolutely. And that is how the MJ Consulting Firm is attempting to grow. We want to receive funding, and I always give a shout out to the Clinton administration that created a lot of rules and regulations and policies that negatively impacted my community. So I always reach out to them, because whenever you're ready to write that check, you let me know. I'll cash it. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is say we have to start healing these communities.
Right.
And we know that there are children that want to reach out to their biological birth families, right? How can we get them prepared for that, especially if they were taken through the Department of Human Services, which means that as a government system, we created so much more trauma and drama. I cannot even imagine, which is why we have a different group for that. We have a group for a healing group for parents that have been reunited with their children through the child welfare system, like an 8PR order, case dismissed. And we are now creating a therapeutic group for parents that had their rights completely terminated. And it's this grief therapeutic group of support that will be led by a parent that has had their rights terminated.
Yeah.
So we are working on how can we heal these people in these communities, because that is a piece that is missing. That no one talks about. I've never heard of this ghost grieving, which is essentially what it is. You're grieving a ghost because you know that child is still out there, but you have no idea how they are,
Right.
or what they know of you, what they think of you.
Right.
So essentially, we want to create a hub of active social justice as well as this healing component. There may be a piece where families may reach out, and kids that were adopted through the child welfare system may reach out as this place being a hub for them to say,
Right.
I want to be reconnected with my family, but how do we do that? And then
Right.
we can have on staff therapeutic tools to help with that reconnection, even if it's not with the birth family, but with that community.
Right.
That I was from this community. How do I reconnect?
Right.
So thank you so much for that, because I think that can give people a little direction that we cannot fight every termination case.
No.
Unfortunately, we don't know if rights were terminated appropriately or not appropriately either.
Right.
And then it'll take a lot of manpower to try to figure that out.
Right.
But what we will have is on our website an active form that parents can use to say, this is what happened in my case, because we are looking for that pattern that we will then put in a database and say, who was your caseworker? What was the county? What were the therapeutic components? Who was your attorney that represented you, and so forth?
Mm-hmm.
Just so we can start gathering what that looked like. What team operated for that family, and was that team appropriate?
Right. Yeah, I think those are the patterns we're really looking for.
So 2 things that the MJ consulting firm wants to offer. One is justice, and we hope to get that through the coalition. But second is healing. I don't believe you can heal without justice. So we have an entire group that is dedicated in our organization to help that healing piece. So you will be together, led by a therapist, led by someone that aged out of the system as well, to just kind of, it's really, unless you've been in the system, you don't know. And that's why we wanted to create this safe place where people can come together and say, this is what my experience was.
Right.
They're not all negative. The majority of the experience that I know of and the work that I've been doing have been negative. And a lot of the times no one has anyone that they can share that with, especially if they aged out. They don't get any more services. They don't have therapy and so forth. And this is not necessarily therapy. This is just more, how can we come together and figure out what's best for us? Us as in the survivors that aged out of the child welfare system. So we want to be able to offer that. Ultimately, what my goal is, because I always have a goal, I want to sue. I want to sue for generational trauma. I want to sue for, all of the negative emotional impacts that the system created that could have been averted.
Mm-hmm.
It could have been averted if
Yeah.
you supported the family and not support your biasness about what you believe is what's best for this family. Because
Right.
ultimately, sometimes the goals are the same, but they go about it a different way, and it completely throws off multiple generations of families.
Yeah, and I
have
think
involvement.
it's some of the most egregious, I think, situations there are the people that come at it with the punitive lens.
Yes.
So if you are out to punish parents for being bad parents, A, you need some therapy, because why is that what's motivating you? But then B, it's like that in and of itself is probably the most harmful thing that we could do within the context of the child welfare system, right? Like, in terms of dismantling, like, that's the behavior that needs to be dismantled first, is that the child welfare system is not meant to be punitive. It's not another criminal system. It's meant to be therapeutic and helpful. That's where it started, right? Like, if you look at the origins of it, but it also has this, like, dangerous, it's lockstep with, like, this dangerous thread of saviorism, right? And so, because we save you from your community, which is how we help you, and that's a problem. Which
creates a generational trauma
Right.
of anti-blackness, anti-brownness. I mean, when a child that is a child of color that is adopted by a white family, they internalize the anti-blackness and anti-brownness, even if your adoptive parents did not ever say anything negative about who you are, your ethnicity, your race, your background. The entire world does.
Mm-hmm.
And what that looks like is a colleague of mine had shared a story. She is a transracial adoptee, and her parents were white. Amazing, loving parents. And every time she would go into the grocery store, anywhere, and she would call out for mom or dad, and they'll look at her, and then they'll look at the parent, and they'll go, oh, you have such great parents, such amazing people. You got, like, wonderful. And it was meant genuine, right?
Yeah.
It's meant genuine from that. But
Yeah.
would you say that if a young, Black girl called out to her Black mom? Would you be like, oh, what a great mom she is, because I can just see that.
Like,
It happens
like,
all the
flipping
time.
it is ridiculous.
Yeah, it is. So So then we are told, and mind you, we all drink a portion of anti-Blackness and anti-brownness just by living in white America.
Yeah.
We do out of survival. So I never want people to think that, well, I don't do this or because I do this. It's just a natural thing because we have to survive the system. But these kids, that is the piece that is really, really hard for me, is that they don't even know. First of all, the adults don't even know half the time that they contribute to white supremacy and anti-Blackness and anti-brownness. But these children that are being adopted out, and again, not trying to make the foster parents or adoptive parents villains at all, because they're usually not. I mean, we know of also cases that are egregious, that these children have been adopted out by racist and abusive adoptive parents. So we know that too. I'm not going to say that those numbers are really high. The numbers are really high of these adoptive foster parents returning the kids that they've adopted. That is pretty high.
Yeah.
Because there is no quote unquote attachment. The child never fully attached. But you argued for years during the termination hearing that the child is so attached.
Yeah.
Ooh, you can't have it both ways.
No.
You just can't. So
to end on a fun note, have you ever watched This Is Us?
Yeah.
So that show, I think, it's such an interesting show because they're really engaging with that through the topic, like, you know, because he's a Black man that was adopted by this really wonderful white family.
Great family.
They're such a great family, and everyone's envious of their family life and, you know, like the relationship of the parents, and it's just such an interesting, it's such an interesting lens because, like, to go online and to read the discussion forums about it, I think are so interesting to me about, like, Sterling K. Brown's character about, but about, you know, like, he's so whiny. And those, I think, are the people's reactions that I find to be the most interesting because I'm like, he's not whining. Like, he's a character that's actively engaging in dialogue about, you know, coming. I think this last season was really interesting about, like,
don't share all of it because our
spoiler alerts.
Sorry. I haven't seen it all either.
Well, he's engaging in a conversation. I'm not going to give any spoilers, but, like, about growing up as a Black man in this family of white people and what that meant for him and how he can even articulate it. And that's, like, kind of his story thread through this last season. And I just think it's a conversation that we've never had before in, like, on NBC, you know, all places, right? And so, I think that's a good place to start if you want to see it done in, like, an entertaining way, because I do enjoy going online and reading
I never thought about that.
People that complain about his character being whiny, and I'm like, I think it's really interesting that you think of it as whining. I really do, and I want to engage with you more on that and why it sounds like that.
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
that's really good to know.
Yeah, so that's my fun note to end on. I love This Is Us. I cry every episode.
Oh my god, it's an amazing show.
It's such a great show.
I love Maggie Moore.
It's my stories.
Yeah,
my stories is on every Don't disturb me.
My stories. Ruchi, I am so grateful to have you be a part of this community and to be our civil rights, our civil justice advocate attorney with the MJ Consultant Firm. I appreciate you, and I appreciate how hard you work, and I admire that.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
I'm very excited to do this work with you.
Oh my God, I know. Your email, is it Ruchi Kapoor LP?
It's Ruchi at
my apologies.
KapoorLP.com.
Ruchi at KapoorLP.com.
That's and my website is KapoorLP.com.
Kapoor
so it's
LP.
very simple. Yeah.
KapoorLP.com. And that's how people can find you as well. And then you come to the coalition meeting so you know what's happening, you know what's going on.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. And don't forget to tune in next week, Wednesday, 12 p.m. Mountain Time, for a live debrief with our special guest. We look forward to having you join the conversation.